via Steam Early Access by Tim Morten. Tim started in the industry in 1994 at Activision at Los Angeles. He worked at a mix of large publishers and indie studios since then. And though he started out as an engineer, he spent most of his time as a producer and a team leader. And Stormgate is the first original game that he has released, and he released it on Steam very recently, and he's here to share his learnings. Welcome, Tim. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you guys for having me here. Is there a, clicker for the, okay. All right. Thank you all for coming out to see this talk. I think the real name of this talk could be the most recent time that I made a big mistake. So really, this is going to be delving into some of the things that didn't go as well as we hoped with our early access launch for Stormgate. And hopefully, some of those learnings will help you if you wind up launching a product on Steam. Before I dive into the talk, I want to just explain what I'm doing here. So I run an independent studio based in Southern California called Frost Giant Studios. And Stormgate is our first game. A group of us who used to work together at Blizzard Entertainment on StarCraft left Blizzard to build a new game independently. Clearly coming from a big company like Blizzard that has all kinds of budget and resources and support departments, and going to a brand new startup, a tiny independent studio, means we have to learn how to operate differently. And indeed, launching on Steam is a completely new experience for me. Early access is a completely new experience for me and for the team. So I can't purport to be an expert, but we have gone through this process recently, and so we'll share a little bit about what we learned. Okay, so the first thing is, what is early access? I should mention that Stormgate is a PC game, and I know that this market is very heavily biased towards mobile development, but also that PC is kind of up and coming in India. So hopefully some of you out there are developing on PC. I think mobile developers have so much methodology to how they approach launches, and so much is kind of templatized, metrics driven, like there are best practices that are very well understood. On PC, on Steam, things are not quite as sophisticated. I think we are, as an industry, still figuring out how to operate effectively on the platform. And the platform, to many of us, is a black box. It is something that we kind of have to try things and see how they work. So early access specifically is a stage that is meant to be similar to alpha or beta, but monetized. And what are alpha and beta about? Alpha and beta are about getting feedback from real players. So early access is that, but it is monetized. And so collaboration with community is core, I think, to the success of any game today. Doesn't matter what the platform is. Early access is all about that. So this is how Steam actually defines it for players. Allows games to be played as they progress towards a full release. But it's interesting that how Steam describes early access to developers on the Steamworks documentation, it's slightly different. Here it starts with early access enables you to sell your game on Steam while it's still being developed. So I think Valve understands that as independent studios, we need to generate revenue earlier than big studios that have all of the resources that they need. And so early access, to a great extent, I think, is aimed at independent studios like Frost Giant. So I mentioned it's effectively a monetized open beta, but some of the things that are unique about it, it is meant to be a lower consumer expectation than full launch. So clearly, beta as a designation, early access as a designation, broadcasts that there is still work to do on this game. And so our hope as developers is that players will be forgiving, which I'll get into a little bit later. It does obviously provide real-world testing and market feedback. It's valuable as really a quantitative test of how the market is reacting to your game because it's uncapped. Unlike an alpha or a beta, where you are allowing a finite list of players to have access, unless it's open beta, but generally if it's an invite program, it's a finite list. For early access, there is no cap. And unlike a mobile game that might launch into a specific regional market to do a small test before launching globally, early access on Steam is global. Anybody on Steam can access the game. One of the things that Valve does to offset the fact that the game isn't done yet is it treats reviews differently during the early access period than after the full launch. So in a sense, you get a second swing at reviews later, but early access reviews do still matter, and they are still kept historically. Growing community and discoverability, this last point is really important. I talked about how Steam is a little bit of a black box to us as developers. We don't know what triggers the algorithm on Steam to elevate the discoverability of your game. And we've learned things as we go along. There's some kind of tribal knowledge that's gotten shared between developers, but definitely, unlike an alpha or a beta, early access triggers discoverability on the Steam platform. And so that is a key benefit of early access. Really, for us and for so many developers, early access is about revenue. We can only afford to be unmonetized in an alpha or a beta so long. We have so much capital to work with, whether it's a bootstrapped studio or like Frost Giant, a venture-backed studio, the runway is finite. And so early access is a moment where if developers execute well, it is potentially possible to self-sustain the studio and continue to work on that ultimate 1.0 release of the game. I think many of the studios that I talk to view early access as the launch of their game, kind of like an open beta in the mobile world where monetization might be turned on, even though it's only still a beta. So it is marketed, it is treated in every way like it's a real launch, but it's still consciously not the 1.0. I want to talk a little bit about the poster child for success in early access. Baldur's Gate 3 started pre-production in 2017, and they didn't launch their 1.0 version until 2023. So they had a 6-year development cycle. It was actually just shy of 6, but basically a 6-year development cycle to build that game. But in the middle of that period, in 2020, is when they launched early access. So the final 3 years of Baldur's Gate were development that was occurring during early access. When that game came out as a 1.0 launch, it kind of took the industry by storm. They won just about every Game of the Year award that there was to win. It was a triumph in terms of an independent studio producing a game that was tremendously high quality. But the truth is, when their early access started in 2020, it was a very different game. GameSpot, one of the online media sites, gave it a 60 as their review when it came out in early access. I think it showed promise, definitely, at that point in time, but it was by no means a Game of the Year award winner when it launched in 2020. So I think this demonstrates that early access as a process can work and can produce some really outstanding content. And there are so many examples now of games that are trying to follow in these footsteps of Baldur's Gate. Okay, so key performance indicators, things that we looked at ahead of early access. How do we know if we are positioning ourselves well to launch our early access and hopefully find success both critically and in terms of revenue? So the first one is signups. Many developers take registrations for a beta, for a newsletter, but try to collect actual email addresses for players because Steam as a platform doesn't give that information to you as a developer. Steam actually limits the number of opportunities that you have to directly communicate with the players in your game. So building that direct relationship by collecting email addresses is a metric and is an approach that many of us use. We did that at Frost Giant just using some customer relationship management software, newsletter software effectively that we hooked up to our website. But how many signups you get is one performance indicator. The next one is Steam wish lists. Steam as a platform lets players wish list products. Interestingly, Steam also has a similar function called follow, but wish lists are really the primary metric that most of us use to try to gauge how much pre-release interest is there in the game. And so that happens on platform, and the number of wish lists that you collect winds up kind of being a currency on Steam. The more wish lists you have, the more that triggers the algorithm, and in certain cases, the time duration in which those wish lists happen can also help trigger the Steam algorithm. But that's another key performance indicator, is just how many wish lists have you accumulated ahead of early access launch. And then the third that is becoming increasingly commonly used is concurrency during Steam Next Fest. And if you're not familiar with what Next Fest is a Steam festival that is hosted by Valve multiple times per year. As a developer, you can only participate once, and the time that you participate is meant to be just ahead of your launch. So during that festival, whether you're a single-player story-based game or a competitive multiplayer game, doesn't matter what type of game, you will get data from Steam, and this is public-facing data, for how many players are currently playing your game. And as it happens, because this metric is something that is now widely used to gauge pre-launch anticipation, there's actually organic media coverage that comes out of how many CCUs games are getting. And so if you're in the top 3, you're probably going to generate buzz and be talked about in the industry. But it's also considered a very good predictor of what kind of launch concurrency you might have once early access begins. So each one of these signups with direct email, wish lists on Steam as a platform, and then concurrency during Steam Next Fest are 3 of the prime metrics that developers are looking at to figure out, is this game on track to have a good early access launch? It's worth noting that there have been a number of games that have good performance indicators leading into early access launch and still don't necessarily achieve the success that they're hoping for at early access. These are all some great games. This is to take nothing away from these games or these teams, but much like Stormgate, these games, when they launched, had a mixed reception. Palia actually launched off Steam first, but came later. But Nightingale, Pax Day, Spectre Divide are all there on Steam. And the truth is, players want polished content. And as much as we try to disclaim that something is not a 1.0 launch yet by designating it early access, players really want polished content. And so if you look at the titles that succeed, that really do break out during early access, things like Helldivers 2, Hades 2, Palworld, Manor Lords, these titles generally have either a player fantasy that is really unique like Palworld or a high degree of polish like Hades 2. I think titles like these titles or like Stormgate that are broad in scope but don't have the degree of polish that players are looking for tend to get mixed Steam reviews. And that kind of brings up what are the metrics that we use to gauge success after early access. So there are 4 of them. First one is self-explanatory, revenue. Steam does not publicly share revenue figures for games, but they do share a leaderboard. So you can tell, based on standing in the leaderboard, roughly how well titles are doing. Obviously, for your own title, you get that data. Reviews are very public on Steam and are outwardly facing. Steam reviews impact both player perception of the game in terms of new players coming in. Are they going to invest time? Are they going to invest money in this game? But also discoverability. Steam review scores have direct impact on how visible your game will be on the platform. So that's a very important metric. Concurrency, again, and once again, this is a publicly facing number. Daily active users isn't directly indicated, but it's kind of easily extrapolated. So we look closely at those numbers for our game. We certainly look at the CCU for other games that are out there just to understand, relatively to other early access games, how are we doing? And then last but not least, retention. This is something for our own game that we had to instrument internally. So obviously for other games, we don't have their data, but you can extrapolate a bit just based on fall off over time and CCUs. So these are the primary metrics that we're using on Steam to gauge post-early access success. But for those titles that were on the last slide for Stormgate, the biggest challenge that we're all facing is reviews. And I'm going to harken back to, there's a conference that's held generally in February in the US called the DICE conference. And I remember early in my career attending that conference, and some guys from Blizzard, which I had no idea I would later wind up working at Blizzard. So, was just so excited to see these guys from Blizzard up there on stage because they had made some of the games that I was most excited about growing up, whether it was Warcraft, StarCraft, just, amazing games, Diablo. And so I was eager to hear their advice. And I remember distinctly that the creative director, a guy named Chris Metzen, got up on stage and he said, "Don't release your games before they're ready." And I remember thinking to myself, well, none of us want to release a game before we're ready, but we don't have the same capital resources. We don't have the fire hose of money that World of Warcraft produces to be able to just wait indefinitely until we launch our games. And his advice was good. Definitely for Stormgate, for those other titles that were listed on the prior slide, the thing that hurt the Steam reviews was we had to release our games before they were ready. But the reason that we did that is that we don't have the same resources as Blizzard. And I'm sure many of you in this room can identify with that experience of wishing that you could have another month, another year, another few years to finish your game, but not having the luxury to be able to wait to do that. Certainly, it was my hope that early access would set an expectation with consumers that was forgiving, but big lesson learned, consumers reward polish. And so I think a narrower scope with higher polish would have been more successful. And I definitely think that others, as they look at the outcome in terms of Steam review scores that we got for Stormgate, will probably follow that course. I think we'll see developers hold releases if they can, but definitely I think we'll see developers try to focus on narrower scope, higher polish to get a better review response out of early access. And this slide is probably the most important learning. I started earlier on by saying how we viewed early access as a way to be able to continue developing the game. with bad review scores, revenue is not high, no surprise. And so the clear learning there is you actually can't rely on early access for revenue. And Steam actually told us this. We didn't necessarily want to hear it, but they, even in bold, say you should not use early access solely to fund development. To be fair, we're not using it solely to fund development, but we definitely hoped that it would perform better than it actually did. So I think as a developer, having gone through this experience, if I were to do early access again, I mentioned narrower scope, higher polish, but also we would plan for early access to not be a point in time where the game is self-sustaining from revenue, because that has been the outcome, and as a result, we've had to take more investment to be able to continue to polish the game to ultimately get it towards the 1.0 version that we want it to be. Steam is very much a ground-up sentiment kind of community. And players who play on Steam don't exclusively live on the Steam forums. Clearly, there are a lot of other platforms that they go to talk about games. You know, that'll include Reddit, it'll include YouTube, Twitch. So the collective management of those platforms and of player sentiment on those platforms is so essential. It's essential for the titles that succeed, but it's especially essential for titles like us who have had a launch that received a lot of critical feedback. We have a community team, as many developers do, and there's a certain amount that we can do directly by posting to these channels and by responding to comments. But there's also an element for us and others who are in this same position of building experience, building relationships with important, prominent members of these communities. And you know, we all think about this in a marketing sense in terms of user acquisition, but it's also super important in terms of managing retention and sentiment after the game launches, that these are the tastemakers for the community, and what they say has significant sway on other people. So we spend a lot of time trying to reach out to those influencers, trying to include them in our process so that we're getting direct feedback from them. That was true during the development process. It's also true now post-launch. We also make a conscious effort to brief them and to talk to them about what we're doing, what is coming up in terms of patches, and what our plans are for the future of the game. I think the more we're able to do that, the more positive results we see. I'd love to be able to you know, do it even more frequently than we do, but having some kind of regular channel of communication specifically with those content creators is really critical for us, and I think other PC titles share that commonality. The patch cadence, the updates that we provide to the game are also super critical to sentiment. Every patch we release, we see a surge of positivity, and then as time goes by before the next patch, comments start to dip back into negative sentiment. As long as players see that we are listening and that we are making a concerted effort to address the things that they've told us are important to them, sentiment seems to lift and to stay lifted for some period of time, but it decays after that. So regular cadence is something that we've seen that is really critical. Every single one of those updates is like a mini launch. If we don't make a video describing what's happening, create patch notes that really play up the work that's happened, do occasional AMAs, ask me anythings on Reddit, all of these publishing activities that you also do for launch, we do for these patches, because otherwise they kind of go unnoticed and unappreciated except by that core engaged community that is stuck with the game. By doing that, we have seen the tide start to turn for our game. Those other games that I mentioned earlier are pursuing a similar strategy. And so this is kind of a playbook that I'm seeing emerge across the industry for PC, that many early access launches don't meet with the reception that the developer hopes for, and that there is a necessity to then go into chipping away at gaining back positive sentiment through subsequent releases of patches and promotion of those patches. This last point was unexpected, but maybe you guys won't be surprised. We see big differences in community sentiment based on region. Interestingly, China is particularly critical in feedback. We see some particular critical feedback from Russia, Korea after that. But then, you know, in the US or in Western Europe, we tend to see more positive feedback and positive review scores. There's certainly critical feedback from every region. So that's not to say that it's all sunshine and roses, but there are really pronounced differences in how critical that feedback is based on region. I suspect part of that is a reflection of how effective we are at communicating to those other regions. We only localize in so many languages, and there are cases where not all of our update content, like patch notes, get localized. So certainly part of that is communication, but I think part of that also is just that culturally, some regions tend to be more critical on games. For what it's worth, Steam does not segment those reviews by regions. So the review score that the game gets is a blend of all of those reviews. And managing those global expectations then post-launch is something that we're still figuring out how to do, but it's clearly very important and does have potential significant influence on the overall review score. So that's the heart of the content that I wanted to talk about today. From here, I'd love to open it up to questions to anybody in the audience about the early access process, our experiences with Stormgate, or anything else I can help answer. And I think we have a microphone, so let's go to one of the hands that were up out there.
A shift towards early access games being viewed negatively by the player base, because there have been games that have come into early access and just been abandoned after getting some money through. So how do you sort of overcome that challenge that you have getting into a game with early access?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So just to repeat it for the rest of the room to make sure you heard, there have been games that launch into early access and are then abandoned. And so there is some automatic negative sentiment in the player base around early access because of that. And how do you overcome that? It was interesting that when we were crowdfunding, because we did some crowdfunding late in the process for Stormgate, we talked about being funded to launch, and to us that meant early access launch. And I think it turned out players were really sensitive to knowing that a developer is actually funded to 1.0 launch because of specifically what you're talking about. And so that was a lesson learned for us. I think we since then have tried to be super clear about our status, that we are committed to getting to 1.0 and that we are continuing to make updates to 1.0, but it is about building trust. And I think, again, going back to the funding part of all of this, if I had it to do over again, you know, we would plan in such a way that we could say confidently at the beginning of the process, this game is funded all the way to 1.0 launch, just so that that trust is established up front, because that was a challenge that we had to deal with. So great question. Thank you. Leave it
Hi.
to the microphone holder to
yeah.
pass. Yeah.
Hey, Tim.
Got it.
Yeah, thanks for the great talk. It was nice and informative. I have two questions. The first one was about Steam Next Fest. correct me if I'm wrong, but you had a demo, right?
We did, that's right, Steam Next
How did
Fest.
that turn out for you guys? And the second one is Stormgate has always been like free to play, advertised as free to play, right? So you did say you were expecting revenue from early access, and how those two like go against each other in a kind of sense?
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So for the, I guess the first question, sorry, repeat it again, was
The demo from Steam Next Fest.
just how did our Next Fest demo go? Okay, so yeah, we participated in Steam Next Fest in February of this year, and we actually had a really good experience with Next Fest. Next Fest runs for basically a week. A lot of upcoming titles have demos in Next Fest. We wound up doing a lot of work the week before Next Fest to try to increase our visibility, and that paid off. We wound up being number 2 in the stack rank for the Next Fest that we participated in. And I talked about how wish lists are kind of a currency on Steam. Next Fest generated more wish lists for our game than any other activity that we did over the course of our entire marketing campaign. So the importance of participating in Next Fest was huge. And I've talked to some other publishers, some other developers. They've had similar experiences with that. So yeah, good question about Next Fest. And then the second part of the question, I guess, was just about Stormgate being free to play and sort of how that interacted with our, I guess, revenue expectations at early access launch. So this audience, and I guess I haven't said this, so I apologize, but Stormgate is a real-time strategy game. So it's similar to Warcraft or StarCraft. This audience is an audience that's used to boxed products, used to premium games. And so a good portion of this audience attaches to fairly high value bundles. So we did offer a bundle that included, I lost the mic, there it is, campaign content, co-op content, you know, kind of almost as if it were a premium or a box product. And that produced a certain amount of attachment. But I think once the reviews came in and were so mixed, we're basically at a 50% review score that we're trying to gain positive sentiment back from, the attach to those bundles plummeted. But it is free to play, so we have, you know, some number of players who are still engaging with the game as a result. So that's good, and we still get some data from that. But from a revenue perspective, it definitely wasn't what we hoped for. But thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Hi. So this question is about Wishlist's relationship with early access. So, okay. So there is a little book written by Chris Zukowski who helps indie developers with marketing their game on Steam. And in one of the little articles, he writes that before going into early access, it's good to have about 7,000 wish lists. And of course, he does mention that it's not like a hard cap or a number, but as an indie developer, do you think that we should look at a certain amount of wish lists before we go into early access, or can we get into early access with a goal to increase wish lists through early access, as you've already mentioned a bit?
Okay, great question. Yeah, is there a specific threshold for wish lists you should have before early access, or is it okay to treat early access as a way to get more wish lists? We looked every day at the stack rank of titles with wish lists on Steam. And our goal was to climb up that leaderboard as high as we could before early access. We cracked the top 30, but I don't think we cracked the top 20. Would have loved it if we did. But for us, it really was a strategy of engaging over a long period of time. From the second that we founded our studio, we announced that we were going to make this game. From the second that we announced the game, we stood up a Steam page to start collecting wish lists. And what we saw was that there was steady growth in wish lists over time as awareness grew kind of organically. And there were certain marketing activities, showcases like Summer Game Fest or the Game Awards that we participated in. I mentioned that Next Fest in particular had huge impacts on the number of wish lists that we got. But the thing that really grew our wish list was just that organic growth. Like it always kept going up and to the right over time. I would say, I believe that it is best to try to capture as many wish lists as you can before early access, because wish lists have so much impact on your discoverability during early access. As far as what the right threshold is, I don't have a specific recommendation. I think for us, for the scale of project that we were building and the budget that we had for the project, it was important to get very high in the wish list. I think depending on the scope of the project, being lower in that leaderboard absolutely could be okay. But either way, I think getting as many as you can before early access launch is important and is critical. But thank you for the question. Oop, I heard that.
Hello, sir. Thank you for the informative session. And actually, it was answered almost. Sir, have you heard about a game called No Rest for the Wicked? Because right now, early access seems like a double-edged sword where the Hades and No Rest for the Wicked had schedules. They were both for Game Awards and they had hype. But one was successful and the other was not. And as someone who's from and still coming up to the industry, I could not fathom why one was just not down and one was up. So any idea on that?
I heard Hades, and what was the other title you mentioned?
No Rest for the Wicked. No Rest for the Wicked.
No Rest for the Weary. Got it. Yeah, I think there's no objective answer to this. Like, why did one succeed? Why did the other not succeed? My sense is Hades, for one thing, it's a sequel. Supergiant has a following, both from the first Hades, but also from their prior games. And so there's a bit of built-in audience and positivity. But even setting that aside, the level of polish that that game had when it launched, it was basically ready for a 1.0 release by most developer standards. And definitely there are things that they've continued to polish and continued to do, but they set a very high bar. And you know, they scoped their game appropriately. They're, for those of you who aren't familiar with Supergiant, ex-Electronic Arts developers who created an independent studio, and they have a very tight team. It's not big. I think it's ballpark 30 people. And so the games that they make are designed to be achievable with that team size. And so I think they were very smart about it. You know, why didn't the audience respond better to No Rest for the Weary? I confess I haven't had a chance to play it, so I don't have a first-hand opinion, but I suspect not the same following as the Supergiant guys, and probably not that same almost 1.0 release-ready level of quality that Supergiant achieved. Those would be my guesses, but yeah, I wish I knew the objective answer. I would be so much better equipped to succeed in this business if I did.
Hey team, thanks for the insightful session. I had a couple of questions. The first one was regarding the Next Fest that you mentioned. And as you said, every studio has just one chance to feature in Next Fest. Are there any recommendations from your side on how should we approach it? Like, what's the best way to get the max out of a Next Fest? So that's the first question.
Got it. Okay, so how to get the most out of Next Fest. I think doing a lot of promotional activity the week before paid off for us, and definitely coordinating. I talked about how we try to regularly talk to content creators ahead of big beats in our development. We definitely did that for Next Fest and tried to set up a streaming schedule so that our visibility on Twitch would be as high as we could make it during that period. All of those things bring up the concurrency and the discoverability even within Next Fest during the period of that. The guys who were number one, they had a genre that's kind of closer to dark and darker. I mentioned we were kind of number two in the stack rank. So I think their genre helped them, but they were also really smart about gamifying participation in Next Fest. So they did things like players who, I don't know if it was hours of engagement or number of missions, but there was an engagement reward of digital content that they could keep for when the game launched. And I think there was even a random chance of winning an Amazon gift card. So, they kind of gamified participation, which really incentivized players to keep coming back, playing their game, boost the concurrency, boost the visibility. So those were some of the tricks that we saw that we admired, but I'm still learning too. So.
Thank you. One thing in continuation with that, is there any specific seasonality to which Next Fest to participate, or it's just depending on your optimal time frame for launch?
Yeah, any tips on seasons? We have seen that every Next Fest continues to evolve. So for example, the one that we participated in was only promoted on the Steam front page for the first 2 days of the week, and then it got buried a little bit deeper, which they hadn't done for the previous. Some of these most recent Next Fests have had overwhelming numbers of participants. So I think it's not necessarily as much about seasonality, though that could be a component, as it is just about how the fest continues to evolve. And it's getting more competitive, is my observation. I think Steam is aware of this, and they're experimenting to try to strike a balance that does enable good discoverability for titles. But probably the single biggest tip I could give is to try to build a relationship with some of the Steam account managers to help you navigate as they evolve it.
Understood. And one final question, sorry. Regarding how long a game should be in early access. You've seen certain games like Project Zomboid, which has been in early access for like a really long time, and still the reviews are pretty good. But I would expect most studios to have like a more closer time frame beyond which they want to launch. So any guidelines on that? Like how long should a game be in early access?
Yeah, how long in early access? So clearly, Baldur's Gate pulled off a 3-year early access to great success. I think there's probably no one. It's probably more about how long does it take you to get to a point that the game is so polished that it's going to receive a positive response from the market, from players. That would be my guess. But again, I'm still learning too. So I think we are out of time, but do we have time for one more?
Hello. Wonderful session. Thanks for that. I'm Vaibhav. I'm founder and CEO of Abracadabra Software Solutions, and we develop RPG war games. So can you guide us on what should be the minimal budget to try out different markets as far as the battle games are concerned?
I heard, what should we be doing to try out different markets, and what was the last part?
What should be the minimal budget? Because we are the indie studio, like you know the situation for small studios, always out of the pocket, and it's very difficult to manage the expenses for marketing. So as far as the Steam influencer marketing is concerned, or any sort of marketing is concerned, how much budget we should think about, especially for role-playing games, battle games?
Got it. Yeah. So this is one of the biggest differences for me coming out of a big publisher where they would spend double-digit millions on anything that they launched, sometimes triple-digit millions, to being in an indie studio where really all of our dollars should go to development, and we just carve out what we can for marketing. I've heard some rules of thumb, at big publishers that your marketing budget should be 50% of your dev budget, or crazy numbers like that, that clearly as an indie studio, we can't do that. We don't have that ability. For us, it wound up being single-digit percentage of our development budget, the marketing budget, and even that was painful to carve out. I think there's so much opportunity, whether it's through community events, whether it's through working with content creators, traditional media outlets, just doing traditional PR. Like the cost effectiveness of all of those things is so high relative to the things that people really spend money on, like the showcases or the website takeovers, traditional paid media spends. I think it's possible to do successful marketing on a very, very low, like, single-digit percentage of your dev budget. But it relies on being scrappy. That's the best I could say.
One follow-up question for
We are running out of time. He'll be available for questions later. We just have one more question here, and after that we'll stop.
Hi Tim, this is Manik here. So for a product under development, how soon should we set up a page on Steam for wishlisting?
Yeah, our approach was that as soon as we announced the game, which was years before we got to early access, we stood up that Steam page because of that phenomenon of wish lists going up over time. I think recently there's kind of been, the success of Apex, which was a late drop. It was like they announced at the absolute last moment. And from a marketing perspective, there was a lot of talk that that's desirable. But the amount of spend that it takes to do a late drop like that just isn't practical for most developers. And we haven't seen a lot of other companies, even big companies, succeed at doing that after Apex. So I would say as early as you feel like you have enough materials, key art, what you need to stand up that Steam page just to take advantage of building as many wish lists as you can.
So even way sooner than alpha if we have enough materials.
Yep, yeah, we did it far in advance of having a playable.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it.